Today is Saturday, May 30th, 2026, and today is National Hole in My Bucket Day, which sounds less like a holiday and more like the beginning of a minor personal crisis. It also feels strangely appropriate for today's episode, because May 30th ended up becoming a collection of stories about people treating things with enormous seriousness, sometimes heroically, sometimes violently, and sometimes in ways that feel almost surreal from a modern perspective. Executions, duels, auto races that look more like survival experiments. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and your reasonably calm guide through humanity's long history of strange decisions. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was executed in Rouen, France. She was around 19 years old, and honestly, one of the strangest parts of Joan of Arc's story is how impossible it sounds even before the ending. A teenage peasant girl claims to hear divine voices telling her she must help save France during the 100 Years' War. And somehow, people listened to her. Not briefly, not symbolically. Kings listened to her. Military leaders followed her. Armies changed direction because of her. Joan convinced Charles VII to allow her involvement in military campaigns despite almost every social structure of the time working against that possibility. And then she helped inspire a series of victories that dramatically shifted morale in France, which made her enormously important and enormously dangerous politically. Eventually, Joan was captured by Burgundian forces allied with the English. Then came the trial. And the trial itself feels deeply revealing about power, because technically it focused on charges like heresy and religious violations. But underneath it all was something much larger: control. Joan disrupted expectations: religious expectations, political expectations, gender expectations. She wore armor, cut her hair short, claimed direct divine guidance, publicly challenged authority figures. And societies throughout history tend to become very uncomfortable around people who blur established categories too successfully. The execution was public. Crowds gathered. Officials worried she might become a martyr even before she died. And according to several accounts, witnesses were visibly shaken afterward. Some reportedly believed they had witnessed the execution of an innocent person. Others feared divine punishment. What fascinates me most is that the people trying to erase Joan of Arc accidentally help immortalize her instead. Because history remembers her far more vividly than most of the officials who condemned her. And maybe that happens more often than power institutions expect. But centuries later, public honor and reputation would still carry enough emotional weight that people were willing to kill over them. On May 30th, 1806, future U.S. President Andrew Jackson fought a duel against Charles Dickinson. And this story somehow manages to feel both absurd and terrifying at the same time, because modern audiences tend to imagine duels almost theatrically. Elegant, formal, dramatic. But the reality was, people genuinely died doing this, frequently. And the argument leading to this duel escalated through insults, political tension, gambling disputes, and attacks involving Jackson's wife Rachel, which in that era could become socially explosive very quickly. Dickinson was considered one of the best shots around. Calm, accurate, dangerous. Jackson knew this. So during the duel, Dickinson fired first. The bullet struck Jackson in the chest, and remarkably, Jackson stayed standing, which honestly sounds fictional. Accounts suggest the bullet lodged dangerously close to his heart and remained in his body for years afterward. But Jackson then raised his own pistol carefully and fired back, killing Dickinson. And one thing I kept thinking about while reading through this story is how differently people once viewed public honor. Today, somebody insults you online and maybe you argue in comments for 20 minutes before making coffee. In the early 1800s, people occasionally scheduled homicide appointments at sunrise. And yet, within that culture, Jackson's actions actually increased his reputation for toughness and fearlessness. The reputation followed him politically for the rest of his life, which says a lot about the era itself. The line between violence and leadership looked very different then. And speaking of activities people accepted as normal despite unbelievable danger, the first Indianapolis 500 was basically organized mechanical chaos. On May 30th, 1911, the first Indianapolis 500 race took place, and compared to modern racing, it sounds completely unhinged. The cars were fragile. The safety systems were minimal. Dust constantly covered the track. Drivers wore little protective equipment, and despite all that, people absolutely loved it. Partly because early automobiles still carried this feeling of experimental possibility. Cars weren't fully domesticated technology yet. They still felt slightly wild, and racing became a way to test what machines and humans could survive. The Indianapolis Motor Speedway itself had already gained a rough reputation before the first Indy 500. Early races on the original crushed stone and tar surface caused horrific crashes. At one point, conditions became so dangerous the track was rebuilt using millions of bricks, which is why the speedway became known as the Brickyard. And then came the race itself. 40 cars, 200 laps, 500 miles. At a time when many ordinary roads were still rough, muddy, and unreliable. People gathered in enormous crowds to watch machines roar around the track at speeds that genuinely felt shocking for the era. And honestly, one thing I love about early racing history is how improvisational everything feels. Pit crews experimented constantly. Drivers repaired cars mid-race. Mechanical failures happened everywhere. Nobody fully knew the limits yet. The winner of the first Indy 500, Ray Haran, introduced something unusual, a rearview mirror, which sounds incredibly ordinary now. But at the time, many race cars carried riding mechanics whose job was literally to look backward for the driver. Haran replaced the extra passenger with a mirror instead, and that tiny innovation helped reduce weight and improve efficiency, which is one of those wonderful little moments where history quietly shifts without anyone realizing it immediately. And after spending today's episode around executions, duels, and race cars that looked only partially attached to the ground, I kept thinking about how strangely wide human culture really is. The same species capable of building violent honor systems and dangerous mechanical spectacles also created Bugs Bunny, which honestly feels important to remember sometimes. Born on May 30th, 1908 in San Francisco, California, Mel Blanc became one of the most recognizable voices in entertainment history, even though most audiences never saw his face. And that's part of what makes his career so fascinating. Mel Blanc didn't become famous for looking heroic, or glamorous, or commanding attention physically. He became famous because he could sound like practically anyone, or anything. Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Porky Pig, Tweety, Sylvester. At one point, his voice was so associated with Warner Brothers Animation that he was simply called the Man of 1,000 Voices. And honestly, one thing that stood out about me while reading about him was how physically demanding voice acting actually became. People tend to imagine cartoons as lightweight entertainment, but Blanc treated vocal performances almost athletically. Different accents, speech patterns, rhythms, laughs, breathing styles, entire personalities built purely through sound. And somehow, many of those characters became instantly recognizable within a single syllable. What's especially remarkable is how long those voices lasted culturally. Generations of children grew up hearing Mel Blanc performances without necessarily realizing the same person was behind all of them, which almost makes him feel less like a celebrity and more like part of the background architecture of American childhood itself. And maybe that's why his work endured so long, because underneath all the chaos and slapstick, the characters still sounded emotionally committed. Ridiculous, but sincere, which is honestly harder to do than it looks. Something today's stories kept circling back to was seriousness. The intense seriousness people once attached to belief honor, competition, and identity. And while some of it feels distant or strange now, I don't think modern humans are actually that different. We still build identities around systems. We still defend reputations emotionally. We still gather around spectacles that make us feel alive. The details change, but the human instinct underneath them stays surprisingly familiar. Maybe that's also why someone like Mel Blanc fits oddly well beside the rest of today's stories. Because humor and performance are part of that same instinct too. People looking for meaning, connection, release, recognition. The methods just look a little less dangerous. Anyway, that's the strange collection of human behavior May 30th left behind. And before I go, here's today's deeply accurate quote. Human beings, who are almost unique in having the ability to learn from the experiences of others, are also remarkable for their apparent disinclination to do so. Douglas Adams. If you'd like to explore more of my narration work, projects, or general historical wandering, you can find it all at waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns, and I appreciate you stopping by the timeline for a while. I'll see you tomorrow.